February 1, 2003, Kennedy Space Center, Florida. Space Shuttle Columbia lifted off at 10:39 a.m., carrying 7 astronauts on a 16-day scientific mission. The launch was routine, or so it appeared. The shuttle climbed into the sky, the external tank separated, and the mission proceeded nominally. However, 81 seconds after launch, something critical occurred that would seal the fate of the shuttle and its crew. A piece of foam insulation, approximately 1.67 pounds in weight, broke loose from the external tank and struck Columbia's left wing. The impact occurred at approximately 1,600 miles per hour, creating a hole in the shuttle's thermal protection system, the critical heat shield that protects the shuttle during the extreme temperatures of re-entry. At the moment of impact, the engineers monitoring the launch at NASA's Mission Control Center and at the contractor companies did not fully realize the severity of what had occurred. The foam strike was captured on video, but the implications were not immediately grasped. However, within hours, engineers began to piece together what had happened, and alarm bells started to ring. The engineers concerned, engineers at NASA and at the contractor Thiokol, began to analyze the foam strike. They ran calculations. They reviewed data. The more they examined the impact, the more concerned they became. The foam strike was not trivial. It was significant. The hole created in the heat shield could potentially compromise the shuttle's ability to withstand re-entry temperatures. These engineers understood the stakes. They knew that the heat shield was critical. They knew that a breach could be catastrophic. They raised the alarm. They requested imaging of the wing to assess the damage visually. They wanted to investigate further, to understand the full extent of the damage and to determine if the shuttle was safe to continue the mission. This was not alarmism. This was professional expertise, grounded in engineering knowledge and a deep understanding of the risks involved in space flight. The first dismissal, however, their concerns were met with resistance from management. NASA's leadership, focused on maintaining the mission schedule and avoiding delays, was reluctant to acknowledge the severity of the foam strike. The rationale was straightforward. Foam strikes had occurred on previous shuttle missions. In fact, foam insulation had struck shuttles before, and those shuttles had returned safely. Therefore, the reasoning went, this foam strike was probably manageable. This was the beginning of normalization of deviance. Because previous foam strikes hadn't resulted in catastrophe, the risk was normalized. The absence of disaster was misinterpreted as proof of safety, rather than as a lucky escape. The psychological bias was powerful. It's happened before, and we're still here. Therefore, it's probably fine. The authority gradient. The engineers who raised concerns were lower in the organizational hierarchy than the managers who dismissed them. This created a steep authority gradient. The engineers understood the technical risks, but they faced a psychological barrier to forcefully challenging management's decision to proceed. In NASA's hierarchical structure, challenging a superior's judgment could be seen as insubordinate or as not being a team player. The engineers had expertise, but management had authority. And in this organizational culture, authority often trumped expertise when the two came into conflict. The stage was set for tragedy. A critical warning had been raised, but it had been dismissed. The shuttle would continue its mission, carrying 7 astronauts toward a fate that had already been sealed by the foam strike 81 seconds after launch. Over the next 16 days, as Columbia orbited Earth conducting scientific experiments, a quiet battle was taking place behind the scenes at NASA. Engineers continued to push for a detailed investigation of the foam strike. They wanted imaging of the damaged wing. They wanted to understand the full extent of the damage and to assess whether the shuttle was safe to return. The request for imaging. Engineers at NASA's Johnson Space Center and at Thiokol submitted formal requests for imaging of Columbia's left wing. They wanted to use Department of Defense satellites to photograph the wing and assess the damage. This was a reasonable, professional request grounded in legitimate safety concerns. However, these requests were denied or not escalated through proper channels. Management decided that imaging was not necessary. The rationale was that foam strikes had occurred before, and the shuttle had returned safely. Additionally, there was no contingency plan for a damaged heat shield. If the imaging revealed severe damage, there would be no way to repair it in orbit. Therefore, the reasoning went, why conduct imaging that would only create anxiety without providing a solution? This was cognitive dissonance in action. NASA's leadership was aware of the foam strike and the potential risk. However, acknowledging the severity of the risk would require taking action delaying the mission, conducting detailed investigations, potentially aborting the mission if the damage was deemed severe. These actions would be costly, embarrassing, and disruptive to NASA's schedule and reputation. To resolve the psychological discomfort of knowing about a potential risk without taking action, NASA's leadership rationalized away the concern. They told themselves that the risk was minimal, that foam strikes were normal, that the shuttle had sufficient redundancy to handle the damage. This rationalization allowed them to proceed with the mission without the psychological burden of acknowledging a serious, unresolved safety issue. The authority gradient and suppressed dissent. The engineers who continued to voice concerns faced increasing pressure to accept management's decision. The authority gradient was steep. Managers made it clear, through both explicit statements and implicit signals, that further pushing for imaging or investigation was not welcome. The organizational culture did not reward dissent. It rewarded team players who accepted management's decisions. One engineer, Bob Doherty, reportedly said that if he were an astronaut, he would want to know about the foam strike. This sentiment reflected the genuine concern among engineers about the safety of the crew. However, such concerns, when voiced to management, were often met with dismissal or pressure to conform to the organizational consensus. Groupthink and illusion of unanimity. Within NASA's management structure, a consensus developed. The foam strike was not a serious threat, and the mission should continue. This consensus created an illusion of unanimity. Managers who had doubts kept them private, fearing that voicing concerns would make them appear weak or alarmist. The false consensus then reinforced itself, making it even harder for anyone to break ranks and voice serious concerns. The engineers, aware of the management consensus and the steep authority gradient, largely fell silent. Their expertise and their warnings were suppressed by an organizational culture that prioritized schedule and consensus over critical safety analysis. The fateful decision, as Columbia orbited Earth, the decision was made. The mission would proceed as planned. The shuttle would return on February 1, 2003. No additional investigation of the foam strike would be conducted. No contingency plans would be developed. The crew would re-enter the atmosphere with a damaged heat shield, unaware of the danger they faced. February 1, 2003, 8:59 a.m. EST. After 16 days in orbit, Space Shuttle Columbia began its descent toward Earth. The shuttle was traveling at approximately 17,500 miles per hour, descending through the upper atmosphere. The crew commander Rick Husband, pilot William Willie McCool, payload commander Michael Anderson, mission specialist Kalpana Chawla, mission specialist David Brown, payload specialist Laurel Clark, and International Space Station specialist Elon Raymond were preparing for landing at Kennedy Space Center. The re-entry was supposed to be routine. Thousands of re-entries had been conducted successfully. The crew was experienced and professional. Everything appeared nominal. However, the foam strike that had occurred 16 days earlier had created a vulnerability that was about to become catastrophic. The breach widens as Columbia descended, and the external temperatures reached approximately 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The damaged area of the heat shield began to fail. Hot gases, which should have been deflected by the heat shield, began to penetrate into the wing structure. The breach widened. The structural integrity of the wing was compromised. The shuttle's onboard computers detected anomalies in usual readings from sensors in the left wing. However, the crew, unaware of the foam strike and the damage, did not fully understand the significance of these readings. They were following normal re-entry procedures, trusting in the shuttle's systems and their training. February 1, 2003. Space Shuttle Columbia disintegrated during re-entry. 7 astronauts dead. The Columbia disaster stands as one of the most tragic failures in the history of human space flight, and as a profound lesson in the catastrophic consequences of an organizational culture that suppresses expertise, dismisses warnings, and prioritizes schedule over safety. The investigation that followed the disaster meticulously documented the sequence of events, the engineering analysis, and critically, the organizational failures that led to the tragedy. The lessons were stark and undeniable: the peril of normalization of deviance, the fact that foam strikes had occurred on previous missions without catastrophic consequences led NASA's leadership to normalize the risk. The absence of disaster was misinterpreted as proof of safety. This psychological bias, it's happened before, and we're still here, blinded the organization to the genuine danger posed by the foam strike, the danger of suppressed expertise. The engineers who raised concerns about the foam strike possessed genuine expertise and legitimate safety concerns. However, an organizational culture with a steep authority gradient and a preference for consensus over critical analysis suppressed their voices. The organization lost access to the very expertise it needed to make a sound safety decision. The cost of cognitive dissonance. NASA's leadership, aware of the foam strike and the potential risk, rationalized away the concern rather than confronting it directly. This rationalization allowed them to proceed with the mission without the psychological burden of acknowledging a serious, unresolved safety issue. However, the cost of this rationalization was the lives of 7 astronauts. The fragility of safety culture. Despite NASA's reputation for safety and excellence, the Columbia disaster revealed that the organization's safety culture had eroded. The pressure to maintain the shuttle program's schedule, the desire to avoid delays and embarrassment, and the organizational dynamics that discouraged dissent had combined to create a culture where critical safety concerns could be suppressed. The importance of speaking up and psychological safety. The engineers who raised concerns about the foam strike demonstrated professional courage and expertise. However, they were operating within an organizational culture that did not provide psychological safety for dissent. A truly safe organization requires a culture where people feel empowered to raise concerns, even if those concerns challenge the status quo or question management decisions. The question for all of us. Columbia reminds us that human error is often not a simple mistake, but a systemic failure rooted in organizational culture, psychological biases, and the relentless pressure to prioritize schedule and reputation over safety. The question, and how could NASA make such a mistake? The question is, where in my own life, or in the organizations I'm part of, am I seeing signs of normalization of deviance, suppressed expertise, or reluctance to speak up about safety concerns? Am I creating an environment where people feel psychologically safe to raise concerns, even if those concerns are inconvenient or challenging? Am I rationalizing away risks because it's happened before and nothing bad happened? Am I allowing organizational pressure to override critical safety analysis? The legacy of Columbia is a call to perpetual vigilance in safety culture, a commitment to valuing expertise and encouraging dissent, and a profound understanding that the human element, when suppressed by organizational pressures and psychological biases, can lead to catastrophic failures that cost lives. The 7 astronauts who died on Columbia: Rick Husband, Willie McCool, Michael Anderson, Cal Panichala, David Brown, Laurel Clark, and Elon Raymond deserved better. They deserved an organization that listened to its engineers, that took safety concerns seriously, and that prioritized the lives of its crew over schedule and reputation. Their legacy is a reminder that in any organization, safety must be paramount, expertise must be valued, and the courage to speak up must be protected and encouraged.